In the silence of a grand mansion overlooking the restless waves of Monterey Bay, a man sits alone, staring into the hollow echoes of the life he once knew. William Harrington, a billionaire weighed down by fortune but robbed of joy, is haunted by the memory of a love he let slip away. On the very night when grief presses hardest against his chest, a knock at the door breaks the stillness. Standing before him is a woman, weary and fragile, holding the hand of a little girl whose eyes seem all too familiar. What follows will tear down the walls he built and awaken a truth he never dared to face. If this story moves you, please consider subscribing to the channel, leave a comment sharing where you're listening from, and give this video a like. Every gesture of support helps keep stories like this alive. The mansion stood on the cliffs of Monterey Bay, like a silent guardian of time. Its glass walls mirrored the grey ocean, and the waves crashed against the rocks below in a steady, almost funereal rhythm. The wind carried the salty scent of the sea, mingled with the faint fragrance of pine trees lining the road. Inside, however, the silence was suffocating, a silence so heavy that even the ocean's roar couldn't pierce it. William Harrington sat in a leather armchair by the cold fireplace, his eyes fixed on a glass of wine that had long lost its taste. The fire had died hours ago, yet he hadn't bothered to rekindle it. The chill didn't disturb him nearly as much as the emptiness did. On this day, nothing could soften the weight pressing against his chest. It was the anniversary of Catherine's death, his wife, and even the calendar seemed to mock his solitude, reminding him of what could never return. The mansion, with its endless corridors and flawless marble floors, had been built to impress, to host extravagant parties and gatherings with politicians and businessmen. But now, every corner felt like a museum of silence. The glittering chandeliers illuminated nothing but emptiness, and the grand halls echoed his footsteps back to him as if ridiculing his existence. The fortune that had once brought him power now felt like a gilded cage, with loneliness as its only guard. As the wind rattled the windows, William wondered when power had become synonymous with exile. His mind drifted back to his beginnings. The boy once called Will, raised in a small Texas town. Back then, his hands smelled of damp soil after rain, and his dreams were simple, almost innocent. He didn't dream of stock markets or dinners in New York. He dreamed of promises whispered beneath a star-filled sky. He dreamed of Juliet. Her name crossed his thoughts like a forbidden whisper. Juliet Moreno. Her eyes carried the warmth of a sunset over wide fields, and her laughter could turn an ordinary afternoon into eternity. They had grown up side by side, first as friends, later as lovers. With her, William had learned what it meant to belong to someone, not through contracts, but through devotion. That night, staring at the reflection of the extinguished fire, William let memory take him. He saw himself again at 19, swearing to Juliet that he would come back for her, that no distance or ambition could tear him away from his roots. But life in New York had swallowed him whole. The pace of the city, the doors that opened, the endless invitations, all of it pulled him further from that promise. And then came Catherine, the cultured, influential woman who ushered him into a world of wealth, but also bound him with invisible chains. Now, Catherine was gone. A brutal accident had taken her 5 years earlier, and since then, William had lived among shadows. Yet even in the wake of his wife's death, his deepest grief didn't come from losing her. It came from what he had abandoned long before, the pure love of Juliet, buried under decades of silence. The mansion seemed to sneer at his nostalgia. Portraits of Catherine lined the walls, her elegant presence frozen in gold frames. There was no trace of the boy named Will, no sign of Juliet, no reminder of the life that might have been. William rose and walked to the window, watching the waves crash violently against the cliffs. The sea screamed a truth he already knew. Every empire of stone and steel is worthless when the soul lies empty. He pressed his hand against the cold glass, as though trying to reach beyond the weight in his chest. Nights like this made the past crueler. The waves reminded him of the soft songs Juliet once hummed as they lay on the grass, gazing at the stars. The silence of the mansion echoed their endless riverside conversations in his hometown. It was as if every detail of his present life disguised a memory of all he had lost. William squeezed his eyes shut, fighting to push the memory away, but the harder he resisted, the stronger it returned. The vision of Juliet's smile, the warmth of her hand entwined with his, the promise he had never kept. A familiar ache settled deep inside him, an ache made of regret and longing. He sat again, the untouched glass of wine heavy in his hands. The clock on the wall ticked mercilessly, each second striking like an accusation. Wasted time, unlived time, lost time. William exhaled slowly, his head sinking against the back of the armchair. Outside, the waves grew harsher, as if announcing something yet to come. He couldn't explain why, but the air carried a sense of imminent change, as though the night itself was holding a secret ready to be revealed. And while the mansion's silence swallowed him once more, William Harrington remained still, unaware that within hours a simple knock at his door would forever alter the course of his life, and summon back the echo of a past he had tried so desperately to silence. Texas felt like another world whenever William tried to recall it from the cold armchair of his mansion. There was something in the scent of red earth, in the heat that made the horizon shimmer beneath the sun, that no New York skyscraper could ever recreate. It was there, among the wheat fields and nights lit by fireflies, that he had lived his first and truest love story. Juliet Moreno was the daughter of teachers, a young woman who always carried books in her arms and a smile on her face. To everyone else, she was the sweet girl of the town, but to Will, she was the entire universe. Her laughter blended with the sound of the small church bells, and every simple gesture, the way she braided her hair, dipped her feet in the river, scribbled poems in her worn-out notebook, was sacred to him. They met at dusk near the wooden fence behind her house. They would sit on the grass, watching the sky shift its colors, speaking of dreams that seemed too far away for such a small place. Juliet longed to become a literature teacher, to share stories and awaken worlds within others. Will dreamed of studying economics, of turning his intellect into something greater, of leaving town to prove he could conquer the world. It was on one of those nights that he held her hand and made the promise that would mark both of their lives. "I will come back, Juliet. No matter where I am, no matter what happens, you are my home." She believed him. Her eyes shone with tears of hope, glistening softly in the twilight. They sealed the vow with a kiss, innocent yet intense, wrapped in the chorus of crickets echoing across the fields. When the acceptance letter for his scholarship to New York arrived, the entire town celebrated. It felt as though Will carried with him the pride of every neighbor, every teacher. But for Juliet, that letter was a gift wrapped in farewell. At the train station, on the day of his departure, she clung to his arm. "Promise you'll come back. Promise you won't forget me." He repeated the words, looking into her eyes, never imagining how heavy those syllables would become in the years ahead. New York was a whirlwind. The streets pulsed with urgency. Voices blended in languages he had never heard before. Skyscrapers seemed to pierce the sky. Every door that opened was an opportunity. Renowned professors, invitations to exclusive events, strategic friendships. The world laid itself at his feet. And little by little, the letters he sent to Juliet lost their urgency. First weekly, then monthly, until silence replaced words. Juliet kept writing, even without replies. She told him about the countryside, the school, the poems she was reading. But each envelope that reached him felt heavier, carrying a hope that no longer fit in Will's heart, now consumed by ambition. He told himself he would return, that there was still time. But in New York, Time ran at a different pace, and soon the promise began to unravel. It was at a lavish reception that he met Catherine. Daughter of an influential family, educated in Europe, Catherine had the power to open doors with a single handshake. At her side, Will, now signing his name as William, found not only a partner, but also a ladder into the empire he was beginning to build. Their marriage was more than a union. It was a social contract that cemented his place among the elite. Yet on the night he toasted at his wedding beneath golden chandeliers, William felt an emptiness stab at him. As guests raised their glasses, one thought cut through the haze like a blade. Is Juliet still waiting? He pushed the memory away, drowning it in champagne, in speeches, in photographs, but no matter how hard he tried, the echo of that broken promise lingered, gnawing at the corners of his soul. Time did the rest. Memories of Juliet were buried beneath meetings, contracts, and fortunes, but they never vanished completely. All it took was one night of silence, one date marked on the calendar, and her face would return with cruel clarity. Catherine, with all her elegance and intelligence, had never been able to fill that space. For what remained was a wound that could not heal, because it was not only the memory of a woman, it was the memory of who he had once been and all that he had abandoned. And so William built his empire, drifting further from the boy who had once promised to return. The vow made by the wooden fence now lived only as a shadow, but a shadow that never left him. That night, as the fireplace in his mansion lay unlit, and the waves of Monterey Bay pounded endlessly against the rocks, William knew there were ghosts that time could not banish. Ghosts that carried names, laughter, and eyes. Ghosts that still called him by the name he no longer used, Will. And somewhere, far from him, the promise still echoed, waiting to be confronted. The night had settled heavily over Monterey Bay, the waves striking the cliffs like restless drums. William Harrington had retreated to his study, half buried in the silence of leather-bound books and the low hum of the storm outside. The weight of memory pressed on him as it so often did, a suffocating shroud of regrets and ghosts. He poured another glass of wine, though he already knew it would taste of nothing. And then the sound came, a knock, soft, hesitant, almost swallowed by the crash of the sea. He frowned, lifting his head. No one came to the mansion at this hour. Guests no longer arrived, friends no longer visited. For years his evenings had belonged to silence alone. Yet there it was again, 3 knocks, sharper this time, echoing through the cavernous halls. William rose, his footsteps resounding against the marble floors as he moved toward the front door. The vast space of the mansion seemed to stretch longer than usual, each step tugging him towards something he could not yet name. When he pulled the heavy door open, the sight before him froze him where he stood. A woman, soaked from the mist, her clothes worn, her eyes shadowed by exhaustion, and beside her, clutching her hand, stood a little girl no older than 8. The child's face was pale, framed by dark hair, dampened from the sea air. Yet it wasn't the frailty of her posture or the uncertainty in her gaze that stopped William's heart. It was her eyes. They were his. The same shade, the same piercing clarity he had seen in his own reflection countless times. His breath caught, and the glass of wine slipped slightly in his hand. The woman's lips parted, her voice trembling, but steady enough to carry the weight of her desperation. I'm sorry to bother you at this hour. We need food. A safe place to sleep. I can work. I'll clean, I'll cook anything, just please. William's chest tightened as recognition tore through him. Juliet. Her name left his lips in a whisper, fragile, almost disbelieving. And in that instant, time folded in on itself. He was no longer William Harrington, billionaire of Monterey Bay. He was Will, the boy from Texas who had once promised her the world. Juliet's expression hardened. Her chin lifted with pride, though her body trembled with fatigue. There was no warmth in her gaze, only the echo of pain long buried. "I didn't come here for you," she said coldly. "I came because of her." She pressed her daughter closer, shielding the girl from his stare. The silence between them was brutal, filled with years of unspoken words. William's eyes shifted back to the child, unable to tear himself away. His pulse thundered in his ears. He did not need to ask, did not need confirmation. The truth struck him like lightning. This little girl was his. "Her name is Luna," Juliet murmured at last, almost as if answering the question he had not dared to voice. Luna. The name hung in the air like a fragile thread. William swallowed hard, his throat burning. His entire empire, the meetings, the deals, the millions, collapsed in that moment into dust. Nothing mattered, nothing carried weight, except for the child standing before him and the woman whose eyes still carried the fire of both love and betrayal. "Come inside," he managed, his voice breaking despite his effort to control it. He stepped back, opening the door wider. But Juliet hesitated, her body rigid, her eyes scanning the grand hall behind him as if it were an enemy's lair. "I won't stay long," she said firmly, "just until she's safe." William wanted to speak, to explain, to beg forgiveness. But the words clung to his throat, heavy with years of absence. He watched as Juliet guided Luna inside, her protective arm never leaving the girl's shoulders. The sound of their footsteps on his marble floor felt surreal, almost sacrilegious, as though the mansion itself recognized the return of something it had been waiting for. In the living room, under the dim golden glow of the chandeliers, William found himself standing across from Juliet once more. His eyes lingered on her face, lines of hardship etched where youth and softness once bloomed. Yet beneath them, he could still see the girl he had loved, the one he had left behind. Luna climbed onto the edge of the couch, her legs swinging nervously. She looked around the vast room, clutching a small stuffed rabbit with one arm. Her presence seemed to fill the emptiness with an innocence that cut William to the core. He knelt slowly, lowering himself to meet her gaze. "Hello, Luna," he said softly, his voice trembling with a tenderness he hadn't known he still possessed. "You must be very tired." The girl tilted her head, her large eyes studying him with quiet curiosity. She didn't answer, only hugged her rabbit closer. Yet in that silence, William felt something shift inside him, an unspoken connection sparking in the space between them. Behind them, Juliet's voice cut through, sharp and unyielding. "Don't!" William looked up at her, startled. "Don't you dare try to step into her life like you were here all along." Her words trembled with fury and pain. "You weren't. I raised her. I carried her through every hunger, every sickness, every night she asked about a father I couldn't give her. You don't get to appear now and—" Her voice broke. She turned away, her shoulders shaking with the effort to hold back tears. William rose to his feet, guilt crashing over him like a tidal wave. The truth was unbearable yet undeniable. Luna was his daughter, and Juliet, broken, proud, unyielding, had borne the weight of his absence alone. He wanted to say her name again, to bridge the chasm between them, but the room fell into a silence too heavy to pierce. Luna, unaware of the storm that swirled around her, leaned back against the cushions, her eyes fluttering shut from exhaustion. William stood frozen, staring at the fragile rise and fall of his daughter's chest as she drifted into sleep. His daughter, his blood, his legacy. Juliet's voice, quiet now, broke the silence once more. "She's all I have," she whispered almost to herself, "and I won't let anyone hurt her, not even you." William's hand clenched at his side, torn between the desperate urge to fall to his knees in apology and the weight of knowing no apology would ever be enough. The storm outside howled louder, rattling the windows, as if echoing the chaos within. And as William looked at Juliet, her face lined with exhaustion, her body braced in defiance, he realized that the night had only just begun. The past he had tried to bury had returned not as memory, but as flesh and blood, and there was no turning back. The storm pressed harder against the mansion's glass windows, its howls seeping through the cracks like the voice of an old grief refusing to be silenced. William stood at the edge of the living room, his gaze fixed on the fragile figure of the child curled up on the couch. Luna's chest rose and fell with the rhythm of innocence, her small hand still clutching the stuffed rabbit. She was his daughter. There was no longer any doubt. The recognition had struck him like a blade, cutting through the armor he had built over years of power, wealth, and calculated distance. And yet, it was Juliet who commanded his attention now. She sat rigidly on the other end of the couch, her body angled toward her daughter as though forming a shield. The years had changed her, but not erased her. The softness of youth had hardened into lines carved by fatigue and battles fought in silence. Her eyes no longer shone with hope, but burned with a fire that dared him to cross the invisible barrier she had built around her life. William took a hesitant step forward, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. "Juliet," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know." Her eyes snapped to his, sharp as glass. "Don't you dare," she cut in, her tone brittle, her pride trembling beneath it. "Don't you dare say you didn't know. You left. You chose another life, and I was left to carry the cost of your absence." The words struck harder than the storm outside. He opened his mouth, but no excuse would form. What could he say? That he had been blind, drunk on ambition, that the promise he once made to her had been buried beneath boardrooms and chandeliers? Every explanation tasted of poison before it even reached his lips. Juliet leaned back, folding her arms tightly across her chest, her gaze locked on him. "Do you have any idea what it means to raise a child alone? To work until your body gives out, to pray she doesn't see the fear in your eyes when you don't know where the next meal will come from? I never wanted to knock on your door. I never wanted your money, your pity. But tonight, I had no choice. She was hungry. She needed warmth. That's the only reason I'm here." William's throat tightened. The opulence of the mansion, its gilded frames, towering ceilings, and marble floors, suddenly felt obscene. Each glittering surface mocked him, reflecting not triumph, but failure. Failure not in business, but in the simplest, most human promise he had ever made. He wanted to reach for her, to bridge the gap between them. But Juliet's posture, unyielding, proud, guarded, warned him not to. So he lowered his gaze to the floor, bowing beneath the weight of truth. "I never stopped thinking of you," he confessed, the words dragged out of him like a wound being torn open. "Not a day has passed that I haven't remembered, but remembering doesn't erase what I did, or what I failed to do." Juliet's lips trembled, but she pressed them shut. Her silence spoke louder than any accusation. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked mercilessly, each second striking louder than the storm, louder than his own breath. Each tick was a reminder of time lost, of years stolen from him, and from the child now sleeping under his roof. He turned toward Luna, watching her small frame sink deeper into the cushions. The sight stirred something raw inside him. For years he had lived in a fortress of isolation, convinced grief had stolen his ability to love. But here, in the soft breaths of this little girl, something shifted, a yearning both tender and desperate. He whispered, more to himself than to Juliet, "She's mine." Juliet's shoulders stiffened. "She's not yours," she spat. "She's mine, mine alone. I carried her, I raised her, I fought for her. You don't get to appear now and claim her like you claim your businesses." Her words cut deep, but William did not recoil. He knew she was right. And yet the truth pulsed in his veins, undeniable. This child was his blood, his legacy, his second chance, if only he could be allowed to take it. "I don't want to take her from you," he said softly, his voice breaking with sincerity. I need to be part of her life. Please, Juliet, don't shut me out." Juliet turned away, her arms tightening around herself. For a long moment, she said nothing. The storm outside filled the silence, the wind battering the mansion as though demanding an answer on his behalf. At last, she spoke, her voice low, almost fragile. "Do you know what it's like to watch your child look into the crowd at school plays, at birthdays, at holidays, waiting for someone who never came? Do you know how many nights she asked me why she didn't have a father? And do you know what it feels like to have no answer but silence?" William's chest caved inward. He pressed a hand against the mantel of the fireplace, steadying himself as her words ripped through him. He had built empires, bent nations to his influence, but he had failed at the most basic truth, being there. Juliet's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. "I will never forgive you for leaving me, for leaving her. But I won't let my pride keep her from safety. That's why we're here, nothing more." Her voice faltered, but she quickly regained her strength, her expression turning cold once more. "Don't mistake this for reconciliation, William. I don't want your wealth. I don't want your guilt. I just want her safe, and when she is, we'll be gone." The words landed like a sentence. William felt as though the ground beneath him had cracked open, an unbridgeable chasm forming at his feet. But he knew he couldn't argue. Juliet's pride was her shield, forged through years of abandonment. He could not take it from her. The mansion grew quiet. Luna's breathing deepened as she slipped fully into sleep, her small body curled against the cushions like a secret. Juliet leaned toward her daughter, brushing a strand of damp hair from her forehead, a gesture tender, almost sacred. William stood in silence, watching mother and child, his own heart splitting under the weight of what he had lost. He longed to kneel, to beg, to weep at Juliet's feet, but he remained frozen, because even in this moment of revelation, words felt powerless. The storm outside raged on, pounding against the mansion like a reflection of the war within him. And in that dimly lit room, William Harrington realized that discovering the truth was not the end of his suffering. It was only the beginning. The morning after Juliet and Luna arrived, William Harrington woke to a house that no longer felt like his own. The silence of the mansion was different now. It carried the weight of other breaths, other footsteps. He had barely slept, haunted not only by the sight of Luna's fragile form curled on the couch, but by Juliet's words, sharp as blades, echoing relentlessly in his mind. He wandered aimlessly through the halls, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floors that once spoke of triumph, but now accused him with every step. At the end of the east wing, he stopped before a painting Catherine had adored, a vast seascape, waves crashing against jagged rocks. For years it had stood as a symbol of resilience, of survival against the storm. But staring at it now, William saw only the echo of destruction. He could not rest until he knew the full truth. Something inside him, an instinct heavier than sorrow, sharper than guilt, pushed him to dig deeper. Juliet's weariness, her desperation, her fire. There had to be more behind it than lost time and broken promises. The way she had hurled the words, "I carried her, I fought for her," burned in his mind. Her pain had roots in places he had never dared to look, and so, at dawn, he picked up the phone. "Find me everything on Juliet Moreno," he told his assistant, his voice low and hoarse from a sleepless night. "Where she worked, what happened to her, every detail. Don't stop until you know." Hours dragged by. Juliet avoided him, retreating with Luna to the guest quarters, refusing to share his table. He respected the distance, though it gnawed at him with every passing moment. By late afternoon, when the storm clouds had cleared and the Pacific sun lay heavy across the horizon, the phone on his desk rang. His assistant's voice was careful, hesitant. "Sir, we found records. Ms. Moreno worked at the Darnell textile plant in San Antonio for nearly a decade. She was dismissed 9 years ago during the restructuring." William frowned. "Restructuring?" "Yes, sir, when Harrington Enterprises acquired the plant. It was part of your expansion in the southern states. Uddis, the words froze him. A long silence stretched across the line. William gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. You're saying it was my company? Yes, sir. She was one of hundreds dismissed. Severance packages were cut short. The plant closed within 6 months. William lowered the receiver slowly, his mind reeling. The room seemed to spin around him, the light too harsh, too cruel. He staggered toward the window, but the glass showed only his own pale reflection. The empire he had built, his proud monument of success, was not a symbol of ambition fulfilled. It was rubble piled on lives crushed beneath its weight. Juliet's life. Her voice returned to him, trembling with rage. Do you know what it's like to raise a child alone? To pray she doesn't see the fear in your eyes when you don't know where the next meal will come from? Now he did. He saw it all. The shuttered factory, Juliet walking out with a box of belongings, the terror she must have hidden as eviction notices gathered on her doorstep. He imagined her at the kitchen table, bills spread out under a weak lamp, her hands trembling over numbers that refused to add up, and all the while he had dined beneath chandeliers, sipping wine while she fought to keep her daughter fed. His chest seized, the air itself turning against him. The truth was unbearable. He had been the architect of her ruin. The irony was merciless. Juliet had not only been abandoned by his absence, she had been destroyed by his presence, by the shadow of his empire stretching into her life. While he rose higher, she had been pulled into the depths he never even glanced at. That evening, unable to hold the weight inside him, William walked to the guest quarters. He paused at the door, his hand trembling before he knocked. From within came the sound of Luna's laughter, light, fleeting, as Juliet read aloud from a book. The sound cut him open. He could not bring his storm into that fragile peace. He turned away, his reflections stretching long and distorted across the polished panels of the corridor. Back in his study, he poured another glass of wine, but his hand shook so violently he could not lift it. He collapsed into the chair, staring at the ocean beyond the glass. Each wave that crashed against the cliffs whispered the same truth. Every choice has consequences, and his choices had torn Juliet's life apart. For the first time in years, William Harrington felt powerless. His wealth could not erase hunger. His influence could not take back the nights she wept alone. His empire was meaningless against the scars he had carved into her. As night fell, the mansion lay in silence. Upstairs, Juliet tucked Luna into bed, whispering promises of safety against the darkness. And in his study, William sat broken, consumed by the revelation that the empire he had built was not only a monument to ambition, but a graveyard of shattered lives, and the heaviest stone among them bore Juliet's name. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm inside the Harrington mansion. For the first time in years, the corridors no longer echoed only with William's solitary footsteps. There was the soft patter of Luna's small shoes, the sound of her laughter drifting faintly through the halls, the occasional clatter of dishes when Juliet insisted on helping in the kitchen, despite William's protests. But beneath these new sounds, tension rippled like an undercurrent waiting to break. Juliet had agreed to stay, but only under strict terms of her own. For her, she had said firmly, nodding toward her daughter, not for me, not for you. She occupied the guest quarters with Luna, refusing every offer of comfort. The expensive dresses Catherine had once worn remained untouched in closets. Juliet washed the same 2 blouses she had arrived in, hanging them by the window to dry in the salty breeze. Meals were eaten quietly, her plate often left half-finished, as though each bite taken in this house carried the taste of pride swallowed whole. William respected her distance, though it pained him. He longed to break the wall of silence between them, to confess everything, the discovery that his own empire had been the hand that destroyed her livelihood. But how could he speak when every word risked widening the rift instead of healing it? So he waited, biding his time, watching her every gesture with a guilt that grew heavier each day. Not everyone in the mansion accepted her presence. Benedict, the loyal butler who had served the Harrington family for decades, eyed Juliet with thinly veiled contempt. To him, the estate was sacred ground, preserved in memory of Catherine. He had adored William's late wife, serving her with devotion, carrying her wishes even after her death. And now to see another woman, an unkempt, weary stranger, step into the household felt like an intrusion, a betrayal of Catherine's legacy. He made no effort to hide his disdain. His words were clipped when addressing Juliet, his tone colder than the marble floors. When she offered to clean or help prepare meals, he would sneer quietly. "This is not your responsibility, ma'am. We have staff for that." The title ma'am carried no respect, only mockery. Juliet bore it with stoicism, though William noticed the stiffness in her shoulders each time. She refused to argue, refused to rise to Benedict's provocations. Pride would not allow her to show weakness. Instead, she focused on Luna, keeping her daughter's days filled with quiet stories, lessons and laughter, shielding her from the bitterness that haunted every corner of the mansion. One evening, William entered the dining hall to find Juliet already there with Luna. The child was giggling as Juliet cut her food into small pieces. For a moment the scene warmed him, the simplicity of it, the life he had never known within these walls. But Benedict stood in the corner, his eyes sharp, his lips pressed into a thin line. When William took his seat, Benedict leaned discreetly toward him. "Sir," he murmured, "it is not my place, but you should be cautious. Some people see opportunity in tragedy. They may seek comfort here, but what they truly desire is security, wealth." William's fork clattered against his plate. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of a storm. "Enough." The butler stiffened, though his face remained composed. "I only mean to protect what is yours." William turned his gaze to Juliet. She had heard every word. Her hand had frozen midway to her plate, and in her eyes was not surprise, but the familiar resignation of someone long used to suspicion and judgment. She lowered her gaze to Luna, hiding the tremor of pain beneath a mask of indifference. Rage flared in William's chest, not at Juliet, but at the cruelty of the moment, the reminder of how the world had always looked at her, and how even under his roof she was forced to endure the same scorn. He wanted to lash out at Benedict, to defend her with thunder, but Juliet caught his eyes and gave the slightest shake of her head. "Don't," her look said, "not in front of Luna." Dinner continued in silence, each bite a battlefield of unspoken words. Luna, innocent and unaware, told a small story about the stuffed rabbit she carried everywhere. William listened, smiling faintly at her voice, but his jaw remained tight. That night, as he stood in his study, staring into the darkness beyond the window, William understood what Juliet's battle truly was. It wasn't just survival, it was dignity. It was the need to prove, even in the shadow of the wealth and power that once abandoned her, that she remained unbroken, unbent, unclaimed. And William knew, if he was to earn even a fraction of her forgiveness, it would not come through wealth or apologies. It would come through respect, through the slow, deliberate dismantling of the walls built not only between them, but within her heart. But as the house sank into uneasy sleep, the storm between dignity and resentment simmered, waiting for the moment it would erupt. The days stretched on, each one marked by the fragile balance inside the Harrington mansion. Juliet remained guarded. Benedict kept his distance, yet radiated silent disapproval, and William found himself navigating the thin line between guilt and hope. Yet in the center of it all stood Luna, small, innocent, and unaware of the invisible war raging around her. Children carry a power adults often forget, the ability to bridge divides without even trying. Luna carried that gift in her laughter, her curiosity, her unfiltered presence. She wandered the vast corridors of the mansion with wide eyes, her little hand brushing along the cold marble walls as though trying to leave warmth where none existed. It was William who first noticed how the house began to change when she was near. The echo of her giggles bounced against the lifeless ceilings, filling the silence with something new, something almost holy. For years, the mansion had been nothing more than a mausoleum of wealth, but when Luna's voice carried through its halls, it felt, for the first time, alive. One afternoon, William found her sitting alone in the library, legs crossed on the thick carpet, a box of colored pencils scattered around her. She was drawing on a scrap of paper, her brow furrowed in concentration. For a long moment, he simply stood in the doorway, watching. There was something in her focus, in the way her tongue poked slightly from the corner of her mouth, that reminded him achingly of Juliet when she used to write her poems by the riverbank. "May I see?" William asked gently, stepping inside. Luna looked up, startled, clutching the paper to her chest. She studied him carefully, as though weighing whether or not to trust him. Then, without a word, she held it out. It was a house. Crooked, simple, colored with bold strokes of red and blue. In the corner, beneath a child's uneven sun, stood 3 stick figures, 2 tall, 1 small, holding hands. William's throat tightened. He crouched down beside her, his voice barely a whisper. "It's beautiful." Luna tilted her head. "Do you draw?" The question caught him off guard. "I used to, a long time ago." Her eyes widened. "Can you draw with me?" Something inside him cracked open at that. He had sat in boardrooms worth billions, negotiated with men who shaped nations, but never had he felt as unsteady as he did under the gaze of this little girl. "Yes," he said softly, "I'd like that." And so he picked up a pencil. His hand, so used to signing contracts and drafting deals, stumbled awkwardly over the paper. Luna giggled at his uneven lines, and William found himself laughing too, a sound that startled him, rusty from disuse. Together, they filled the page with shapes and colors, their drawings overlapping until it became a mess of joy. Juliet appeared in the doorway then, her arms crossed loosely. She had meant to call Luna for supper, but when she saw them, she stopped. For a moment, her expression softened. There, kneeling on the floor beside her daughter, William was not the billionaire, not the man who had abandoned her. He was simply Will again, the boy who once sat under the stars and drew dreams in the dirt. But just as quickly, Juliet's guard returned. She cleared her throat. "Luna, it's time to eat." The girl jumped up, clutching her drawing proudly. "Mama, look, he draws like me." Juliet's lips curved into the faintest smile, though her eyes stayed cool. "That's nice, darling." She ushered Luna out, but as she passed William, her gaze lingered for the briefest second. Not forgiving, not yet, but perhaps acknowledging. From that day on, small moments became bridges. William joined Luna in the playroom, where her toys spread across the floor like tiny kingdoms waiting to be ruled. They built castles from blocks, drew kingdoms on paper, staged puppet shows with voices that made Luna laugh until her stomach hurt. Every laugh, every sparkle in her eyes chipped away at the walls around William's heart, revealing a tenderness he had long thought buried. And slowly, Juliet began to notice. She still watched him with suspicion, her pride refusing to bend, but when she saw Luna run into William's arms with unguarded joy, or heard her daughter's laughter echo through the halls, a flicker of conflict passed over her face. She had raised Luna alone, fought tooth and nail to protect her, yet here was a man, Luna's father, bringing a happiness she could not deny. The mansion itself seemed to bend under this new rhythm. The cold marble floors grew less hostile when covered with Luna's crayons and stuffed animals. The air, once heavy with silence, carried the sound of bedtime stories, of questions only children ask, of laughter spilling into spaces once filled only with regret. William began to live for those sounds. Each evening, as Luna grew sleepy, he found himself hoping Juliet would linger in the doorway, listening. Hoping she might see not the man who had failed her, but the father who was learning, slowly, clumsily, desperately, how to love his child. Yet the tension remained. Every gesture toward Luna drew him closer to Juliet's guarded heart, but every memory of the past reminded her why she could not let it soften so easily. The house was no longer silent, but beneath the laughter, old wounds still pulsed. Still, William clung to one truth. It was Luna, small and radiant, who was pulling them toward something none of them had ever dared to hope for. And though Juliet tried to fight it, even she could not ignore the fact that her daughter's laughter was beginning to stitch the torn edges of two broken worlds. The days inside the Harrington mansion began to weave themselves into something almost resembling routine. Luna's laughter echoed through once silent halls. Juliet moved with quiet dignity, and William found himself rediscovering what it meant to live, not just exist. But the balance was fragile, like glass stretched too thin, and it was destined to break. The fracture came one evening at dinner. Juliet had cooked, insisting on preparing a simple meal despite the protests of the kitchen staff. She served pasta and vegetables with hands that trembled only slightly, and Luna beamed proudly at her mother's effort. They ate together in the vast dining hall, chandeliers casting soft golden light over a table that had so often witnessed only William's solitude. Benedict stood nearby, his posture stiff, his eyes sharp as he observed. His loyalty to Catherine's memory still burned like a torch, and to him Juliet's presence was an insult, a trespass. He had served the Harrington family for decades. He had seen the empire rise, the mansion flourish, Catherine herself walk these halls with grace. And now he watched as another woman, poor, weary, uninvited, sat at the same table. It was more than he could bear. When Juliet excused herself to fetch more water for Luna, Benedict leaned closer to William, lowering his voice though Juliet was still within earshot. "Sir," he murmured, "forgive my bluntness, but this cannot continue. She is not one of us. She comes from nothing, and nothing is what she will bring. If she remains, it is not for the child's sake, it is for her own. Women like her see opportunity and seize it. Be careful. She will ruin what remains of your name." The words fell heavy into the room. Juliet froze in the doorway, the glass pitcher trembling in her hand. Her back stiffened, but she did not turn. Luna looked up from her plate, sensing tension she could not name. For a long moment William said nothing. His fork lay untouched, his eyes fixed on the reflection of the chandelier in his wine. The silence stretched so taut that the ticking of the clock grew deafening. And then William pushed his chair back. The sound of it scraping against the marble floor echoed like thunder. He rose slowly, his gaze locked on Benedict. "Enough," William said, his voice steady, though fire burned beneath it. Benedict straightened, expression calm but eyes defiant. "Sir, I only mean to protect you, to protect the honor of this house. She is—" "Don't you dare," William cut him off, his tone sharp enough to slice through the air. "Don't you dare speak of her that way." The butler blinked, startled by the venom in William's voice, but William wasn't finished. His eyes flicked to Juliet, still standing rigid in the doorway, and then to Luna, who watched with wide, frightened eyes. "She is not an opportunist," William continued, his voice rising. "She is not a threat. She is the mother of my child. And that child—" He pointed toward Luna, his voice breaking for the first time. "That child is mine. Do you understand? They are my family now. My family." The words thundered through the hall, filling every corner, every shadow. Juliet's hand shook, a drop of water slipping from the pitcher and splashing onto the marble. Her eyes shone with something unreadable, shock, disbelief, perhaps even the faintest flicker of something softer. But she said nothing. Benedict's lips parted, but no words came. He had served William for decades, had seen him through triumph and tragedy, but never had he heard him speak with such raw conviction. The billionaire, who once seemed carved from stone, now stood trembling with fire, defending not his wealth, not his empire, but the two people who had come to him out of desperation. William stepped closer, his tone final. "If you cannot accept that, Benedict, then you have no place in this house. You are dismissed." The silence that followed was suffocating. Benedict's face paled. For a moment he looked as though he might protest, but the weight of William's fury silenced him. With a stiff bow, he turned and left the dining hall, his footsteps fading into the distance. The echo of the door closing behind him left the mansion strangely quiet. William's chest heaved, his fists clenched at his sides. He turned toward Juliet, but her face was unreadable. She set the pitcher down on the sideboard with deliberate care, her movements calm despite the storm in her eyes. Luna broke the silence first, her small voice trembling. "Are we your family now?" The question pierced William deeper than any blade. He knelt beside her chair, his hand trembling as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Yes," he whispered, his eyes misting. "Yes, you are." Juliet stood frozen, her heart pounding. She wanted to fight the words, to call them hollow, too late, undeserved. But something in his voice, in the way he looked at Luna, cracked the armor around her chest. For the first time since stepping into this mansion, she allowed herself to wonder if change was truly possible. Dinner ended in silence, but it was no longer the cold, lifeless silence of before. It was a silence charged with something new, something fragile, dangerous, but alive. And as Juliet tucked Luna into bed that night, she replayed William's words in her mind. "They are my family now." For years, she had carried dignity like a shield, surviving in a world that stripped her of everything else. But dignity had never warmed Luna on cold nights. Dignity had never filled her daughter's stomach when hunger gnawed. And now, here in this house she swore she would never belong, William Harrington had stood up for them, for her, in a way no one ever had. The battle for dignity was far from over. But the war had shifted, and Juliet, for the first time in a decade, found herself standing at the edge of a question she was not ready to answer. Could she trust him again? The declaration William had made at the dinner table hung in the air for days, echoing through the halls of the Harrington mansion like a vow carved into stone. "They are my family now." Juliet replayed the words endlessly, torn between disbelief and the dangerous spark of hope she could not extinguish. Luna, however, seemed lighter, her laughter more frequent, as though the very air around her had shifted. But life has a way of testing even the bravest promises. It began subtly, Luna coughing late into the night, her small body restless beneath the blankets. Juliet thought little of it at first, tucking her daughter in more tightly, pressing a kiss to her fevered forehead. But by morning the cough had deepened, and Luna's cheeks burned with a heat that terrified her. Panic seized Juliet's chest. She had lived through nights of illness before, nights spent awake in prayer, begging her daughter's breathing not to falter. But now the fear was heavier, because for the first time in years she wasn't alone. William found them in the guest room. Luna lay curled on the bed, her breaths shallow, her cough tearing through the silence. Juliet sat beside her, stroking her hair with trembling hands, her face pale with exhaustion, her eyes frantic. "She's burning up," Juliet whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't—" "We'll take her to the hospital," William said firmly, already reaching for his phone. Within minutes, the mansion that had so often been a temple of silence erupted into motion. A car was readied, blankets gathered, doors opened. William carried Luna himself, her small body fragile against his chest, her skin blazing with fever. Her tiny hand clung weakly to his shirt, and with every shallow breath she took, he felt his heart splinter further. At the hospital, time lost all meaning. Doctors spoke in hushed tones, their words heavy with caution. Pneumonia. Severe but treatable if she responded well. Juliet collapsed into a chair in the waiting room, her head buried in her hands, her entire body trembling. William sat beside her, staring at the floor, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Hours bled into days. Luna remained in the sterile white room, machines beeping softly, an IV dripping steadily into her small arm. Juliet never left her side, her hand clasping her daughter's even in sleep. William hovered near the doorway at first, watching with an agony he could not put into words. But as the hours dragged on, he pulled a chair to the bedside, refusing to leave. There were moments of silence, heavy and unbearable. Juliet would not look at him, her anger and her fear tangled into something too raw to voice. Yet there were also moments when their grief overlapped, when William reached for a damp cloth to cool Luna's forehead and Juliet did not stop him. When he whispered stories in a trembling voice to calm Luna, and Juliet listened without protest. On the third night, Juliet broke. She sat hunched over, her head resting on the edge of Luna's bed, tears spilling freely. William reached out instinctively, his hand hovering before finally resting gently on her shoulder. She did not push him away. "I can't lose her," Juliet sobbed, her voice fractured. "She's all I have. She's everything." "You won't," William whispered, his voice cracking with his own tears. "She's strong. She's your daughter. She'll fight." Juliet lifted her face, her eyes swollen and red, and for the first time in years, she allowed him to see her vulnerability without armor. Their gazes locked, two broken souls bound by the fragile body of the child they both loved. It was in those hours of fear and waiting that the walls between them began to crumble. William told her stories of the nights he had sat alone in his mansion, haunted by her memory. Juliet spoke of the nights she had begged the universe for strength, of the sacrifices she had made just to keep Luna safe. Each confession was like a thread, fragile but real, weaving something new between them. When Luna's fever finally broke, it was as though the entire world exhaled. Her small body relaxed, her breathing steadied, and the doctors assured them she was out of danger. Relief washed over Juliet in waves, and she collapsed into William's arms without thinking, her tears soaking his shirt. He held her tightly, his face buried in her hair, silently vowing never to let either of them go again. In the days that followed, as Luna regained her strength, the bond between them shifted. Juliet still guarded her heart, but there was a new softness in her eyes when she looked at William. She saw the man who had once left her, yes, but she also saw the man who had sat sleepless by their daughter's bed, who had carried her through hospital doors, who had whispered promises not of wealth or grandeur, but of presence. The storm had tested them, broken them open, forced them to stand together against fear. And in its wake, something fragile and undeniable remained, a shared love, a shared child, a shared hope. Yet Juliet knew the battle was far from over. Trust is not built in days, nor healed by a single crisis. Still, as she watched William hold Luna's hand and make her laugh again, she wondered, for the first time without bitterness, if perhaps the future could be rewritten. The storm outside had passed, but the storm within had left behind a bond that neither time nor distance could erase. The days after Luna's recovery carried a gentleness the Harrington mansion had not known in years. The sterile smell of the hospital was replaced once more by the salt-tinged air of Monterey Bay. But something fundamental had shifted. It was as if the storm had stripped away every pretense, leaving only raw truth behind. William Harrington, who had once measured his worth in balance sheets and acquisitions, now measured time in small, fragile moments. The curve of Luna's laughter, the warmth of Juliet's gaze when she forgot to guard herself, the quiet sound of a child's footsteps echoing through halls that had long been graves of silence. He began to change, not through grand gestures, but through the slow accumulation of presence. Meetings with shareholders were postponed, business calls declined. The empire that had once consumed every waking hour began to feel less like a crown and more like a chain. William spent his mornings in the garden with Luna, watching as she chased butterflies across the hedges. In the afternoons, he sat with her in the playroom, fumbling through puppet shows and board games, his laughter returning piece by piece. At night, he lingered in the doorway as Juliet read aloud, her voice soft, her hair glowing in the lamplight. And Juliet, though still cautious, noticed. She noticed the way he carried Luna on his shoulders, not as a performance, but as instinct. The way he listened when Juliet spoke, not interrupting, not correcting, but truly listening. She noticed how the hard edges of wealth and pride softened, replaced by something simpler, a man trying, perhaps for the first time, to live with sincerity. One evening, Juliet found him in the library, surrounded not by contracts but by children's books. He was practicing aloud, testing the voices of characters, preparing to read to Luna himself. When he caught her watching, embarrassment flickered across his face. But she smiled, small and unguarded, the smile of the girl he had once known. "You've changed," she said quietly. He shook his head, setting the book aside. "No, I'm finally becoming who I should have been all along." Her heart wavered, though her pride held. Trust was fragile, too easily shattered. But little by little, she allowed the walls to lower. She joined him in the garden as Luna played. She accepted his hand at the dinner table. She listened when he confessed his regrets in the still hours of night, his voice raw with truth. For William, each small acceptance felt like a victory greater than any empire he had built. It was not easy. There were moments of tension, arguments over the past, silences heavy with unspoken pain. But unlike before, neither of them walked away. They stayed, they endured, they tried, and in the trying something new began to take root. Months passed, seasons shifted. The mansion transformed slowly, no longer a shrine to Catherine's memory, no longer a tomb of silence, but a living home. The walls bore Luna's drawings, the air carried Juliet's cooking, the halls rang with laughter, music, and life. One night, as the sun set in streaks of fire over the Pacific, William led Juliet to the garden. The air was cool, the sound of waves rising softly against the cliffs. Luna was asleep inside, her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her arm. For the first time in years, it was just the two of them. No ghosts, no interruptions, only the weight of everything they had endured. William stopped beneath the arbor where Catherine's roses once bloomed, now replaced by flowers Juliet had planted with Luna. He turned to Juliet, his eyes reflecting both fear and resolve. "I made you a promise once," he said softly, "a boy's promise, naive, broken. Tonight, I want to make you another, this time as a man who finally understands the cost of love." He reached into his pocket and revealed a ring. Simple, elegant, set with a sapphire that mirrored the color of her eyes. "Juliet Moreno," his voice trembled. "I failed you once. I left you with nothing but broken words, but I swear to you now, I will never leave again. Not you, not Luna. I want to marry you, not to rewrite the past, but to build the future we were always meant to have, this time with truth, with presence, with love." Juliet's breath caught. Her heart thundered, memories of shattered promises colliding with the man kneeling before her now. She saw not only William Harrington, the billionaire of Monterey Bay, but Will, the boy who once whispered beneath Texas stars, who had hurt her, yes, but who had stayed, who had changed. Tears filled her eyes. She wanted to resist, to retreat into pride, but the truth was undeniable. He was no longer the man who had abandoned her. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Yes." William slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands shaking. When he rose, Juliet fell into his arms, their embrace not just of love, but of survival, forgiveness, and a promise renewed. In the window above them, Luna stirred in her sleep, safe in the home they had built together. The new promise had been made, not in innocence but in truth, and for the first time in decades, William Harrington felt whole. A full year had passed since that night in the garden when Juliet had said yes. 12 months marked not by contracts and mergers, but by mornings filled with Luna's laughter and evenings of shared meals around a table no longer empty. The Harrington mansion, once a mausoleum of silence, now pulsed with life. William Harrington had learned to trade the weight of empire for the joy of presence. He no longer measured his days in profit margins, but in the quiet rituals of family, carrying Luna on his shoulders down the garden path, holding Juliet's hand as they walked by the cliffs, reading bedtime stories until his voice grew hoarse. It was not perfect. There were still shadows, still moments when Juliet's eyes carried doubt, when the memory of abandonment pressed between them like an unspoken ghost. But unlike before, they faced those shadows together. Every wound reopened became a wound they learned to heal side by side. On the anniversary of that fateful knock on his door, William prepared something Juliet did not expect. He led her to the garden at twilight, the sky painted in shades of violet and gold. Lanterns lined the path, casting a soft glow that shimmered against the ocean beyond the cliffs. Juliet walked beside him, her hand warm in his, her sapphire ring catching the last light of the sun. Luna ran ahead, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself, her laughter floating through the air like music. At the center of the garden, beneath the same arbor where he had first placed the sapphire ring on her finger, William stopped. He turned to Juliet, his eyes filled with a tenderness that made her heart falter. "Juliet," he began, his voice unsteady yet resolute. "There was a time when I thought love was a promise made under the stars of Texas, fragile and fleeting. Then I learned the hard way that promises mean nothing without presence, without sacrifice. Tonight, I want to close the circle I left open so many years ago." He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small velvet box. Inside rested a new ring, this one adorned not with ostentation, but with simplicity and truth. The sapphire gleamed deep and steady, reflecting the color of her eyes. He sank to one knee, his voice breaking as he spoke. "I promised you once that I would return and make you my wife. I broke that promise. I hurt you in ways I will never forgive myself for. But I stand before you now, not as the boy who failed you, but as the man who has finally learned what it means to love. Juliet Moreno, will you marry me? Not for the past, but for the future we now hold in our hands." The world seemed to still. The waves below crashed in rhythm with her heartbeat. Luna, clutching her bouquet, looked up at her mother with wide, hopeful eyes. Juliet's breath trembled. She saw the man kneeling before her, not the untouchable billionaire, not the ambitious boy who once left, but the father of her child, the man who had chosen them every day for the past year. The one who had traded boardrooms for bedtime stories, and who now offered her not perfection, but truth. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Yes, yes, William." Luna squealed with delight, running forward to hug them both. William slipped the ring onto Juliet's finger, his hands trembling with joy. When he rose, Juliet fell into his arms, their embrace sealing not just a proposal, but the fulfillment of a vow long delayed. The past, with all its pain and silence, did not vanish, but it no longer defined them. What mattered was the circle now closed, the promise remade not under youthful stars, but beneath the lantern-lit sky of a home rebuilt with love. And in that moment, William Harrington knew that what he had once broken was now whole. 2 years later, the Harrington mansion bore little resemblance to the mausoleum it had once been. Where silence had once ruled like a tyrant, the halls now pulsed with laughter, footsteps, and life. The echo of loneliness had been replaced by the music of family. On Luna's 11th birthday, the estate bloomed with color and sound. Balloons swayed from the staircases, ribbons draped the entrance hall, and the scent of chocolate cake filled the air. Children's voices rang out, filling every corner of the vast house with the kind of chaos William once thought he despised. Now he cherished it as the sweetest symphony. The garden overlooking the restless Pacific had been transformed into a playground. Tables covered in bright cloths held plates of food, while children ran across the grass, their laughter mingling with the cries of seagulls overhead, a chorus of joy against the backdrop of the sea. At the center of it all stood Luna, her dark hair tied back with a ribbon, her smile radiant as she blew out the candles on her cake. Her friends cheered, Juliet clapped with tears in her eyes, and William stood just behind them, his hands resting proudly on his daughter's shoulders. "Make a wish, darling," Juliet whispered. Luna squeezed her eyes shut, her little fists clenched in determination. When she opened them again, she looked at her parents and grinned. "I already got it," she said softly. The words struck William's heart with the force of truth. He exchanged a glance with Juliet, whose eyes shone with the same unspoken realization. Their daughter was right. The wish had already come true. Later, as the sun dipped low over Monterey Bay, the guests departed one by one, leaving only the three of them in the quiet aftermath of celebration. Balloons swayed gently in the evening breeze, and the garden glowed in the fading light. William stood at the edge of the cliffside garden, Juliet's hand entwined with his, watching Luna chase the last rays of sunlight across the grass. He breathed deeply, the salty air filling his lungs, and felt something he had not known in decades. Peace. The house behind them no longer whispered of loss. Its walls no longer held only portraits of the past, but drawings and photographs of the life they had built together. It was no longer a monument to silence, but a living home, messy, vibrant, imperfect, but full. Juliet leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. He kissed her hair softly, his hand tightening around hers. For a moment, words felt unnecessary. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was safe, sacred. Luna's laughter carried across the garden, rising above the sound of the waves. And William Harrington, once the loneliest man in Monterey Bay, knew that his wealth, his empire, his legacy meant nothing compared to this. The family he had nearly lost, and the love that had remade him. The mansion that had once stood as a symbol of emptiness now stood as a sanctuary of joy, of forgiveness, of life, a home where there had once been silence.